Hello and welcome everyone this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for Stories of Stewardship in Chicago's Community Gardens in partnership with NeighborSpace. We will be recording this evening's presentation, and we ask that if you have any questions for us, please use them using the Q&A function. A little bit about NeighborSpace. NeighborSpace is the only nonprofit urban land trust in Chicago that preserves and sustains gardens on behalf of the dedicated community groups. They shoulder the responsibility of property ownership, such as providing basic insurance, access to water, and links to support networks so that community groups can focus on gardening. NeighborSpace protected gardens give young and old alike an opportunity to get their hands in the earth and enjoy nature right in their own neighborhoods. And I'd like to welcome Ben Helphand and Robin Cline, who will be moderating and hosting this program today. Thank you so much.
I am unable to start my video. There it is. Start my video. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Helphand, Executive Director of NeighborSpace. And Marguerite, thank you for the introduction. And we're really excited to be a part of the biennial program. You explained a little bit about NeighborSpace, but I wanted to delve in a tiny bit into the history. Just because I know not everybody's super familiar with the organization. It's as you mentioned, it's a nonprofit land trust for community managed spaces. And we fill this unique gap that's not filled by the Chicago Park District or the forest preserves. You generally smaller community created and managed sites. And we grew out of a confluence of two things, a planning process, next slide, please, called CitySpace. In the mid-90s under the early Daley administration. And then the second thing is the fact that communities endlessly innovative, created their own spaces. Neighborhoods that didn't have open space, they would stake their claim on a vacant lot, be it private or city owned, and start gardening. And it was beautiful, but it also made people rather uncomfortable. Because it was uninsured and, who knows what could go on. So the planners had this wonderful idea that they would create NeighborSpace, and we were formed in 1996 with just a few gardens and have steadily grown since then. And by the end of this year, we will have 125 gardens spanning more than 30 acres across 42 wards. Next slide, please. In the long history of community gardens, they are generally treated as temporary uses to be replaced by so-called higher and better uses. And the innovative thing I think about NeighborSpace is that it breaks out of this cycle with permanent community spaces. What we sometimes call the lowest and best use. It's a garden joke. Community spaces come in all shapes and sizes, and it's important to keep in mind, I think, throughout this conversation that while Chicago does have many allotment gardens, those neat little gardens where all the vegetable beds are in little rows, we do have those, and they're wonderful. But there are also plenty of prairie gardens and riparian gardens and sculpture and community farms and play gardens, and sitting gardens, and gateway gardens. If the community can dream it up, NeighborSpace will do our best to try to preserve the land. But that, as Robin is going to talk about next, is not all that we preserve. Next slide, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Robin, and I serve the role at NeighborSpace as Assistant Director, which means that my mission and my vocation is to support the leadership and stewardship communities connected with these 125 gardens. So as Ben mentioned, NeighborSpace was founded on the mission to protect community managed land. But more and more interestingly, we tell the story of our organization's protection. We don't only talk about the land, we talk more and more about the importance of protecting the community effort that is occurring on this land. So in some cases, an active community group who is not yet NeighborSpace comes to us because they have been working on land for 10 years. They're at risk of losing it. They don't want to lose the thousands of hours of community effort and collaboration and history that they've shared together. And so a new garden is secured in a new place, but it has the same name as the old garden. And this is an example of ways in which NeighborSpace protects land and effort. And so as we were thinking about the way that we wanted to share NeighborSpace's story and the multiple stories that emerge from the 125 different gardens, we wanted to raise the idea up of protecting effort. Thinking of a land trust, especially in an urban center, as a effort trust. And by paying attention to effort and stewardship, we can see it show up in really interesting ways. And the interesting ways that stewardship shows up in community gardens will be the focal point of today's discussion. So next slide, please. We thought we would share stewardship stories from across our garden landscape. And the first one that I thought of when we were thinking about this, we decided to name this mini story, The Riddle of the Blue Boulder. And this riddle begins in a NeighborSpace nature play garden. Ben mentioned some of the sort of non-traditional models of community managed open space in Chicago include community managed nature play gardens. And there's a nature play garden in Little Village that's a NeighborSpace site called Hardin-Cito, where there was a very, very supportive group of local stewards. And this particular group of local stewards includes early child care workers, neighbors, principals of nearby high schools. And all of them were coming together to keep an eye on this place that was used as the outdoor classroom area for several early childhood schools around the area. And as is not uncommon, there was quite a bit of repeated tagging and graffiti happening in and around the garden space. And so next slide, please. Because of this, as one of the ways in which our stewardship communities emerge with strategies and ideas, they created a standard operating procedure for taking care of graffiti. And they were very concerned about getting on top of it fast, because that was one of the elements of getting on top of graffiti was to do it quickly. So every time there was a graffiti report, the stewardship team would show up with their graffiti removal kit. And one day when they showed up, there had been graffiti spray painted on one of the bigger boulders. They discovered that an unknown person, unknown neighbor had taken matters into their own hands and had covered the graffiti on the rock entirely in blue paint. So this, as you can imagine, wasn't standard operating procedure, and there were feelings about the rock being painted such a bright blue. But regardless of the individual tastes, one thing in that particular moment was brought to light. There were people and there were neighbors caring for this space that the other stewards didn't know, and that prior to this rock being painted were invisible. So the identity of the folks who painted the blue rock was never revealed, but the fact was that the care of this community garden had invisible stakeholders. Next slide, please. And this blue boulder, in the parlance of NeighborSpace communication, became the symbol for invisible stakeholder. The invisible stakeholder that you don't know is there. Maybe you haven't met them yet. Maybe you will meet them in the future. Maybe they are one of the reasons that you keep inviting new people to your meetings. But it's not only a story of invisible stakeholderness, it's also sort of a stone soup theory. Alternative stewardship made visible, everybody throwing in what they have, a really interesting example of community effort. So that's where the riddle of the blue boulder enters into our conversation today. And it kicks off the larger conversation of how does stewardship show up in NeighborSpace community gardens? And how does it show up in ways that we expect it to? And how does it show up in ways that are surprising? So in the interest of today and gathering folks together, we want to ask, what is special about NeighborSpace stewardship, and why is it so important to protect it? Next slide, please.
So Robin, I guess we never solved the riddle because we still don't know who painted the rocks blue, or do we?
No, we don't.
No.
That's the beauty of the story.
Let's keep it a mystery. So the image you see before you is from Englewood. It's the Hermitage Street Community Garden. And I wanted to talk a little bit about healing in gardens and the relationship of stewardship and healing. In much of our public world, maintenance and stewardship is designed to be invisible. If we think about our typical park, they usually hide the maintenance. The maintenance yards are kind of tucked away on the side. And the maintenance is what happens before you get to do what you want to do. The picnics, the baseball, the gatherings. But at community managed spaces, this is often turned on its head. Maintenance and stewardship they're one of the activities that the community is there to enjoy. So it's a fusion of form and function. At the community spaces, maintenance is on full display and anyone who goes by can see it. So it's care in public. And it can have a fantastic feedback loop into the lives of individuals and the community more broadly. Diane Nesta Hodges is a garden leader at the South Merrill Community Garden in South Chicago, put it beautifully in a Facebook post a couple of weeks ago. She put, "First care, care brings concern, concern brings action." I wrote this over my desk. It rings incredibly true. One of the most common stories I hear from gardeners is about how caring for these spaces is healing to them on a personal level. And there are too many tales to recount, from survivors of war and violence to those dealing with the traumas of contemporary urban life. But there is a common thread. There's something about the act of caring for nature and these community spaces which works to heal the self at the same time as you're caring for the spaces. Emily Berry is a gardener at the Hermitage Community Garden. From this image, I don't think she's actually in that image, but she gave a talk a couple of years ago telling her story. She had come from the South, grew up on a farm with her parents, and she had lost one of her sons and was in a rather deep depression. As she put it, there was a hole that couldn't be filled. And then she explained, and I quote, "When my hands are in the dirt now, it's a spiritual thing because my soul is being filled again. When I'm in the garden, I love to see things growing again because I'm changing and growing just like my garden." Next slide, please. Garden stewardship can also be community or collective healing. The long shadow of war, slavery, and displacement can reverberate over generations, and it can be very difficult to find a consistent space where communities can heal from these collective traumas. For example, NeighborSpace has been working very closely with the Chai Youth Council to make permanent the First Nations garden on the Northwest side. And many spaces in Chicago talk about their gardens explicitly as healing spaces for the African-American community. Environmental activist Sandra Henry put it beautifully last weekend at the Bronzeville Neighborhood Farm, which is where this image was taken, at their annual Spring Awakening. And she said, and I quote, "The ring shout came over with us when we came from the continent. And so did farming, so did living in community, so did the builders and the carpenters that came with us. It's really important that we continue those practices here in the United States. And so what you are doing today at the farm is exactly what we did centuries and centuries ago. And if we're going to continue to build community, we have to also build farming and putting our hands in the soil and sharing that knowledge and experience with the people that you love and the neighbors is exactly how we begin to heal ourselves." So one thing is clear from these stories of individual and collective healing and the so many others that we have heard from gardeners over the years, is that beneath the veneer of stewardship, beneath what looks to the outside world is just simply weeding, a lot more is going on, a lot more than meets the eye. And with that, I wanted to pass it back to Robin, who's going to introduce some of our garden leaders who are here today to share other stories.
Next slide, please. So when we were putting the pieces of this discussion and presentation together, we asked our participants to come with a nugget of a stewardship story and to share how it shows up on their sites. To share, next slide, please. Sometimes how stewardship is doing something simply because other people are doing it. And I think this slide of 5 people with brooms and rakes is a very good example of that. Next slide, please. Sometimes stewardship is looking at the same thing together and caring for it at the same time, and then having that shared experience of caring for something at the same time. And sometimes stewardship is more about value than volume, and it's less about how much you can grow, but it's about how much you can learn. Next slide, please. Stewardship is often play. Play protects the place. We've learned that as we've built some of the nature play spaces over the last few years. Stewardship is sometimes meeting your neighbors for the first time in 10 years, even though you've lived right next door to them. Next slide, please. Stewardship is often working through conflict together. And that's a really important part of the stewardship story. Stewardship is having conflict over what you're going to grow, and sometimes choosing cherry tomatoes because there's always an abundance of them and they're easy to share, and larger tomatoes will get stolen. Stewardship is sometimes just showing up to a meeting to vote on vegetables. So with that in mind, I'm going to do a quick, brief introduction of our panel stewards and their gardens, and I'll let them introduce themselves more in detail through their story. McKinley Community Play Garden is situated in the McKinley Park neighborhood of Chicago and is a unique nature play garden model. And we have today with us the amazing educator and community leader, Jessica Fong, with us to share about her experiences. We will then transition to hear a stewardship story from Riverbank neighbors, NeighborSpace riparian habitat leased from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which was formerly an overgrown riverbank that was reclaimed and transformed by community members into a restorative trail. And we have with us here Pete Leki today to share about this amazing NeighborSpace. And finally, we will hear from the Garfield Parks neighborhood's Fulton Street flower and vegetable garden leader, Angela Taylor, who is a community organizer, a farmers market organizer, an amazing community garden leader, and a friend. So we'll kick it off with Jessica Fong, who was an important steward at the Little Village Play Garden, Hardin-Cedo, and is now a leader at McKinley Park Community Play Garden. And Jessica, tell us your story of stewardship.
Hi, everyone. As Robin mentioned, my name is Jessica Fong. I am a Chicago Public School educator, early childhood at Balma Thomas Early Childhood Center in McKinley Park. So I live in McKinley Park and I also work in McKinley Park, which is something that is very intentional in my life, to live in the community that I work in, to be able to provide as much support to my students and their families as possible, and understanding the community that I live in, I think is very important. So if we could go to the next slide. Hello. Oh, yeah, keep going. I think she's got a couple slides of the people that she introduced. Thank you. There it is. Yeah, and the next one. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So the McKinley Community Play Garden, we've changed names since this picture. So this is a picture of when construction was happening. We got rid of the word park because we didn't want people to get confused by the word McKinley Park. We are now McKinley Community Play Garden. This picture is of the space when it was originally being constructed. And the history of this space is interesting because it was a lot that NeighborSpace had owned for X number of years. I should know the number, but many years. And it's about 2 or 3 city lots. And it's right next to the Chicago Public Library, also McKinley Park Public Library. And the space was had these mature trees. It still has these mature trees. And it was a path basically around this sort of nature space, just a grass and trees kind of place. And it had been managed by one dude, as Ben likes to say, one dude had been managing it for many years. And it started to get a little overgrown because he wasn't able to manage it anymore. And Liz Gress and Katie Flores in the neighborhood got involved and started to work with NeighborSpace to develop this into a nature play garden. So it became from one person managing it to then the three of us managing it and helping the community come up with the plan, along with Site Design, I think is the name of the architectural firm, and developing this more into a play space for the community, for the children and families of the community. And so you see there's the construction. And then the next picture, or the next slide, is the play garden today. So this picture is from this week. As an educator, I'm committed to bringing my students to nature spaces as often as possible. When I was at Spry and Little Village down the street from Jardincito, which is the other play space that Robin spoke about, I used to take the students there 3 times a week for a couple hours at a time, as much as possible. And so now that I've moved to this school in McKinley Park and bought a house in McKinley Park, I now take my students from Belma Thomas to this nature play space, which is the space that I also help steward with a group of committee members. And so we've gone from one dude who used to support the space to 3 women, and now a group of about 5 to 10 dedicated volunteers who meet pretty often to start to fundraise and create events for the community, and create free events, but also fundraising events for the space. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, go back one real quick, because there's a nugget of stewardship in that slide that I wanted to throw in there. And so you can see this is, like I said, from this week, this picture. And if you remember the slide from previous, between the metal bars, the vertical metal bars, there was no mesh there. And now you can see that there's this metal mesh between those vertical metal bars. And that's a nugget of stewardship, because the teachers at Belma Thomas came to me and said that there was an issue with those bars because the spacing was inconsistent. Whoever originally put that fence in didn't do it consistently. So there were 4-inch spaces, but then there were 6-inch slots, which the 6-inch slots are too wide for some of our students who are children who are have IEPs or children with special needs. And one of them, without the mesh, ran through the metal bars one day. And so that was a situation where the community came together and said, what can we do? We need to fix the spacing between the 2 bars, and what's a safe way that we can do it. And so we fixed that issue. So it's a tiny nugget of stewardship there. You can go to the next slide. And so these are pictures of children playing in the space. These are my students in the space from this past week. The space has evolved from being just a place where the community would sit and maybe read a book from the library to now a play space where children play and also learn, because we put in a little library in the past couple of weeks when we did a spring cleanup and work day. We put in a little library, and so you can see that the children not only are playing and running and jumping in nature, but are also taking advantage of the books in the little library. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we committed to as a play garden is to have loose parts for the children. And so loose parts are really basically anything you can find in nature that can be moved around, that's loose, that's not fixed, that children can play and explore with. And so one of the issues with the loose parts is that, of course, they get broken, they disappear, they just walk away. And so thinking of ways to continually provide a source of loose parts for the students, for the children and their families. So that's one of the things that we focus on. When we had a clean and green spring work day a couple weeks ago, we pruned some of the trees, and so those pruned branches became some more loose parts. The loose parts that you see on the screen are from basically the first, I think, week that we were open, and they're specially made, I think, by, I don't know if it was Alex, it's somebody who makes these little, what are these things called? Branches that connect to each other so you can build with them. So they're pretty cool. Next slide, please. So one of the other loose parts, if you will, if we use the term loosely, pun intended, is a boat that we have put into the space. And the picture on the left is the boat, the original boat that we put in and now 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, that was systematically destroyed. We believe it's the older children in the neighborhood who come at night. So during the day when you visit, you'll see a lot of really young children, children from my school, children from Namaste, very young children and their families. But at nighttime, it tends to be the older crowd, the pre-adolescents and the adolescent kids, and sometimes even a little bit older. And we believe, although we have not seen, but we believe it's the older children who have started to kind of destroy the space a little bit, if you will. But we see that as part of the process and the lifespan of the things that are in our play garden. So we replaced the boat a few weeks ago when we had our spring cleanup day. And the picture on the right-hand side is the boat that was just replaced a couple weeks ago that has now been tagged, and the steering wheel has been torn off. So the boat was already a boat that had been sitting in the yard for many years, so it was already starting to rot. But that's just one of the challenges that we have as a play space, is thinking about ways to create these pretend play spaces for the children, but also how can we engage the older children in stewarding the space. So I feel as though we've done a really great job in inviting families and young children to steward the space. But our next area of focus as a committee is how are we going to engage the youth of the community to, as Ben said, right, to care first and then show concern for the space and then have action for the space, to steward the space. So that's one of the challenges that we're starting to face and trying to work with the community with. Next slide, please. So this is the original spring workday 3 or 4 years ago now. And you can see that the majority of the folks in this picture are adults. So next slide, please. And it was a rainy workday. This is another workday, and everyone came out and did a great job planting some perennials that look beautiful to this day. Next slide, please. And this is the workday that we had about a month ago. And so you can see this is the photo evidence of how I feel that we've done a really great job in inviting young children and their families to steward the space. These kids were working hard. We were out there for 3 hours. It was hot, and they were spreading the mulch just as much as the adults. They were shoveling, they were raking and working really hard because they feel a sense of ownership and concern for the space. Next slide, please. And you can see in this picture, there's a lot, I think, I didn't count them, but it feels like there's more children than in that first spring workday. So that's one of the challenges that one of the great things we have is that the young kids are really invested. Now we need to work on the older children. Next slide, please. And so the following are a couple of quotes from the committee members, the volunteer committee members that are helping steward the space. This person says she wants to be involved in something in the community. She doesn't have children. She just has a dog. I have a dog, and I love to bring my dog to the play garden. I used to work at the library. This is my way of helping the little park. So this is what motivates the community members to be part of our committee in stewarding the space. Next slide. I followed the initial build and live on the block. I want to help take care of the park. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old who always want to go visit. And next slide, I have a daughter, and I think the space is an awesome resource. It's unique because it's kid-centric and a great way to connect with neighbors. Next slide, it might be the last one, I think. Oh, no, and then it's Riverbank. So that's it. So I'm going to pass it on to the Riverbank steward.
Okay, that would be me. Thanks, Jessica. My name's Pete Leki. I'm also a teacher. I teach at the local elementary school in our neighborhood. And 1991 was the first local school council in CPS, and that school council found our local school ill-prepared to create the kind of educational experience that we felt was needed, although we didn't exactly know what to do. But one thing was that we knew that we need to have more nature because the whole block was asphalt. And the building was in dismal repair. It was a very poor neighborhood. And so we were searching out for resources that didn't cost a lot of money to access. And here we were 2 blocks away from the Chicago River North Channel. And so there was a space of 4 blocks south of Montrose that was Riverbank. It was in as bad shape as the school. It was a dump for contractors. It was a hangout for people who drink and were doing drugs, and for adventuresome kids. So it was not an inviting place. It was kind of a scary place. Almost all of the entire riverbank at that time in 1991 was fenced off with 10-foot high fence to prevent people from coming near the water, because the water was also not in good shape and the river itself was not in good shape. Anyway, this was the thing that we took as an opportunity to think about whether we could do something with that space that would become an accessible nature space for our students. And so we embarked on this whole adventure to think about how we could do that. We didn't know at the time much about restoration of native plants or what it would take to get the authority, the right to actually steward this land. Some neighbors had put up, farther north, had put up docks and things and built structures and kind of acquired the land for themselves. But we started to try to do some work on the riverbank, and some neighbors said, "What are you doing? It's not your riverbank." And we had a hard time figuring out how to get the permission to work there. And that's where NeighborSpace came in at that time and provided a solution for us so that Water School and the local neighborhood group could get permission to steward that land and to restore it and have all the benefits of NeighborSpace, which is like insurance and the actual lease agreement with the landowner, which is a water reclamation district. So that was 1994, I believe, way back when. And since that time, the school has utilized that space, as a walk to laboratory, a gem, a place to experience nature and to work and to study about the river and the riverbank and the animals and birds and insects and plants that might live there. And over these many, many years now, 25 plus years, have created a very, very inviting and beautiful place for the neighborhood. And I just wanted to say a word about this relationship between a school and a neighborhood managed open space like this. And that is that being associated with a school gives you this gigantic heft. You're not, you have an audience, like in our school, we have 700 kids, and then their families, and then associated neighbors living in between, and they're all mixed up with families who are part of the school and neighbors who are part of the community. And so there's a gigantic amount of people and buy-in who both will help with the work needed to restore these areas and maintain these areas and celebrate these areas. And then programmatically, it means that we bring our students, in our case, 2nd grade and 6th grade, study rivers, in their curriculum. And so this becomes their laboratory, their go-to place away from our school. It's only 2.5 blocks to walk to, so we don't have to pay for a bus or anything like that. And we can have these incredible experiences of seeing wild animals and birds and insects and gorgeous flowers. And so and when you think about it, it's like cycling through. Every year we cycle through, like 150, 180 kids and their parents who are helping on these trips. So people become enamored of these places. I think, Jessica, you said a quote, I forget exactly, but I have a similar quote about how that if you don't love a place, you won't care about it, you won't protect it. And people fall in love with these places after a while and truly become protectors of it. And so that's been our experience, and we carry on to this day. I wanted to have this one cautionary tale, and I don't want to end my my talk and something negative, but both with this Riverbank Gardens and with the Water School Gardens, both very large and beautiful restoration projects and amenities for the community, we found ourselves, like with hubris, seeing that our Riverbank and Riverbank Path and the Water School Garden and its gorgeousness was being highlighted in real estate ads. Say, get this, buy this house, it's by the Riverbank Neighbors Path, or get this house, it's by Water School Community Gardens. And so that, our work and our success and the work of these very hardworking, working class people who had created this thing was now being used to transform our community. And it was kind of a horrific thing. At first we thought, how great, we're being recognized, but then we realized too late, mostly, that we needed to protect our community, and in particular, the affordability of living in our community for the people who had created this beautiful amenity before it was snatched away from us. And to a large extent, that's what happened, and we struggled to catch up and to try to find out ways to create affordable housing and support affordable housing. And to this day, we're struggling with that issue, that these beautiful places that we create together with all my comrades around the city, Jessica and Angela and so many other friends, need to have this other overlay of buy-in and affordability for our diverse and beautiful communities of people. So that's all. I'll leave it at that too. So thank you. Yes, that's one of our pathways, and students at the river checking out some birds. Fire is a necessary part of maintaining native ecosystems, and so the past 15 years we've burned the riverbank and see it resurrect itself in gorgeous flowers a month later. A beautiful child taking her things, and there she is.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you guys can see me. I'm so very happy to be here with everyone today to share my story about the Fulton Street Flower and Vegetable Garden. I have a great admiration for NeighborSpace in the work that it offers residents to engage investing in their community. I live in the house next door to my community garden, where my husband and myself have led this garden for the last 14 years. Something that Pete said and something that Jessica said, for me, it takes a hodgepodge of all things positive and negative to actually bring the true hopes of community to a reality. I looked at what the word stewardship means, and it meant our dedication to caring for something or someone and somewhere. And I believe that's what has happened, and the way this community garden has transformed not just me and my husband, but my community. When we originally moved in the house, right along this route and fist was a bunch of milk crates. And on top of those milk crates sat drug dealers. As we moved into the house, we moved also into the garden, and we started to plant the seeds of positive change. What that positive change looked like: cleaning up this garden space, engaging the neighbors that lived on the block, seeing that we were new and we live on a block of legacy residents, but no one had stepped up to take on the leadership of such a beautiful place. Next slide. In our work in restoring the community garden, we were very happy to be privileged to be able to get grant assistance to take on a group of at-risk children in our community. And they were so magnificent in growing themselves in stewardship of the community for themselves. I work for the Garfield Park Community Council, and I wanted to leave these young people with something that expressed themselves. So as we got their uniform shirts for this particular year that they worked, they said, we make it happen and we got your back. And so that was printed on the back of the shirt. So you could see where we were coming from at the front, and you could see where we were going to at the back of the shirts. Next slide. These young people found this space a wonderful space. It didn't matter what part of the community that they came from. They were able to come into this space, feel safe, and feel connected, where they could communicate as young people should, but find challenging in our community because geographical barriers. You may live on this side of the street and I live on that side of the street. And then it's that negative challenge that comes in the middle. Next slide, please. As we work together and the dedication that these young people provided in learning, not just how to plant, but how to weed and how to care for the garden and what the garden grew, it spoke volume to me and only deeper rooted me in the dedication to continue to try and bring a summer youth core of at-risk youth to this garden and now to the community, as now our project is not just at the Fulton Street Flower and Garden. We are stewards to several gardens throughout the Garfield Park community here on the west side of Chicago to keep that work lifted up. Next slide. We were fortunate enough to receive grant funding to build a greenhouse on the site. The kids really loved it to be able to play with the tools, to help erect this greenhouse, and then to bring the work outside into the garden, and just to talk to their friends about what parts they play in making something so magnificent happen in the community. Next slide. As the drug dealers moved away, the seniors that live on the block were able to come out and sit on their front porches, enjoy the warm weather in the spring and in the summer, and see a block that has been cared by from the youth that live around it and that have now become stewards, not just to this block, but stewards of themselves, of their families, and of the community that they live in. I don't have a very long story, but I did want to share. It's a great opportunity to be a steward of anything in life because it shows a dedication that comes from within yourself to take care of something, to build something up and make something happen. It's important that we all participate in some role of stewardship to something to make our world evolve and to make positive change happen. We have really had a very difficult time coming through this pandemic, but we were still able to guard it. We were able to still heal ourselves in some type of way by being outside, putting our hands in the soil, feeling one with the earth, and know that we're doing the right thing to help our world, our community, and our people survive. I know my story was short, but I hope I gave you a lot of energy in it, and I really appreciate the opportunity of speaking with you all. Have a good evening. Robin?
Thanks, everybody. I think
Thanks.
we have, go ahead.
No, I mean, if you have a question, jump in, but I wanted to, I had a thought just listening to Pete and Jessica and Angela, and I've heard, I've known you all for many years, and I've heard your stories before, but it's still kind of makes my jaw drop a little bit. And I think others probably have a similar reaction. Not everybody moves in somewhere and sees a vacant lot or sees an overgrown river or sees an underutilized space and says to themselves, I'm going to do that. I can help transform that. I think it's, pretty unusual. And so I'm wondering, where did you learn that impulse? Where do you think that came from in your own lives? I'm very curious. Any of you could jump in.
I'll take a stab at it. My family originated from the South, and my father always had a little patch out in the backyard wherever we lived. So being a mother and having a family and having an opportunity to kind of mimic what my father did, it excited me when I moved in the house that this space was here. It needed some care, it needed some love, but it was very well worth it. And when you speak of healing, when my father died, that garden was my lifeline because I was able to go in that space. I was able to walk around those garden beds, and I'm good today. As most of you that know me know I am, because I got my fingers touching on everything to revitalize and lift up communities across the city. So that passion probably was born in me. And when I saw it as a reality, I just dived right in and have continued to do my best.
That's wonderful. I have another question, unless Pete or Jessica want to jump in, but there was a couple of questions on the chat about kind of the connection between, since all of you talked about youth related to stewardship to some degree, if there was a connection between the stewardship work and the exposure to nature and the care and academic success. And I know, Jessica, you've looked at this a little bit, so I'll put you on the spot.
Well, when you said the word academic success, I was a little concerned because in pre-K, we're not
broadly speaking.
Yes, broadly speaking, yes. We're not about, like numbers or
no,
not.
No.
It's a little bit different. Yeah, yes. But so I have a lot of research or a big thing about research about language development in nature play spaces. And so just the short of it is that children in nature play spaces use more language than in other play spaces. So as compared to a traditional playground or as compared to a classroom setting. So for young children, all of their learning happens in oral language because they don't know how to read and write yet. They're still getting those skills and will get those skills later on in life. But in early childhood, oral language development is really important. And so you want children to have discourse conversations with each other, with adults, with their teachers, with their parents. And so the nature play space seems to provide a better space for that, or a more conducive space for more oral language, which then you could theorize leads to children having academic gains later in life because they had strong oral language development when they were young.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess I will jump in here.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jessica. I mean, thanks for answering part of this question for me too, and Angela as well. I have a similar background about an affinity for the earth and the plants through my family. In our just quickly to say that in our neighborhood there, the riverbank drops down, and so you literally drop out of this cityscape into a different place. As ragged as it was below grade. You were down 15 feet below the city, in a place where herons were flying and you couldn't hear the traffic on Western Avenue. So this place was so entrancing to begin with. And as far as, we were in 1991, the first local school council, we adopted this position that our mission for the school, our vision for the school was a progressive one. We were about, not about high stakes testing and grades and that stuff. We were moving in a completely different direction of experiencing the world with your family and your community, changing the world, you know, being out, working together, talking together. So our idea of academic success was really different from what it currently CPS is about. And finally, there was a question about what happened with the gentrification here. And no, we were not in communication with real estate partners. We were overwhelmed by what was happening. Imagine, I mean, you can imagine this. So we bought our house in 1980 for $60,000, you know, and then, you know, by 1995, a person could come in, buy a house for 200,000 and then sell it a year later for 300,000 to a person who would sell it the next year for 400,000 and the next year for 500. It's like this money was being extricated from our community without our consent. And where did it come from? I mean, it was like a really horrific thing. And we were taken by surprise. Too soon, old, too late, smart, as they say. So we would do it different today.
I think I was going to piggyback off of that, Pete, just in terms of asking you all. I know when I was talking to Angela yesterday, we had a conversation around what the transformations, the things you learn, the ways that you go into a community care setting and then become surprised by what you don't know that you don't know. So for instance, Angela was talking about the youth that she was working with, and they came for the money, didn't really want to do the work, and didn't know until you do the work what that's going to feel like. And I know from NeighborSpace, that's one of our challenging thing to sort of make visible is what it feels like to be connected to community members and the other people that you're working with. It's hard to take a picture of that, which is one of the reasons that it's so important to have these conversations. But if you all could talk about some of the, like, what people didn't know until they knew it, what people didn't love until they loved it. I heard you were supposed to wait 7 seconds for an answer. And then you can jump back in again. Angela, I'm going to put you on the spot to talk about your youth.
I love that, Robin. These kids, these young people, and I have to remember to call them young people, they're still connected to this garden. And I know these pictures were taken several years ago. They still call and inform me of what's going on in their lives, which for me, even though the way it started, they didn't get it, but when they moved away and stepped out of it, they took it with them. So for me, that was the aha moment. They got it. When my phone rings and I see Jovan's name pop up in the phone, I'm wondering what's going on with him now. And I'm very excited to say that it's always something positive that these kids are doing and asking advisement of what course they should do, if it's the right thing and stuff like that. To me, that's the connection, right? That's when you know it happens. It's not like you can say it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and now it's about to happen. It's organic, like growing food. You cannot put a time on when that seed is going to pop open and when it's going to sprout. You just have to take enough care of it. So when it does, you're able to catch it in that moment, maybe not that exact moment, but to have that experience right there with all things, like the plants and the people. In my garden, we don't just grow plants, we grow people too. And that grows community. And that's something that gets me very excited when I start talking about it. So yes, I hope I answered the question.
You did. Yeah, hearing you
think-
talk, Angela, reminds me or makes me think that there aren't enough. I mean, we have 125 spaces, which sounds like a lot, and there are many other community gardens in Chicago, but it's not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because they're not because just these spaces are beautiful, but there aren't enough spaces that allow what you just described to happen, where people can be trusted, where people can make mistakes, where people have permission to get dirty, where youth and adults and neighbors have the authority to jump in. Because without those things going on, then people don't have the opportunity to build the kind of connections you're calling about. And you're not going to get those calls 10 years later. One other person, somebody put in the Q&A a question about the recently displaced community garden in Logan Square, the Altgeld Sawyer Garden. And I don't have the exact words, but something like, they were asking, do you know about this garden that was displaced and all of the wonderful connections that were that happened there? Do people understand what a loss it was? And no, they don't, because like Robin says, you can't take a picture of those unseen things. I wish we had a better camera. I wish there was an Instagram for community bonds. It would be very hard to do. And I know some people try. But no, I don't think people know what is truly being displaced when these kind of spaces get uprooted, or the inverse, like Pete is talking, where the space remains, but the community gets uprooted. There's deep, deep loss.
Maybe I could just say this one last story about our water school community gardens, which is like linked to Riverbank neighbors. So I was there one night, and it was our Wednesday night work night, and it was already like 8:30, and there was a fire going, and people were cooking, and I was tired. I'd been there since 8 in the morning, so I was leaving through a side entrance, and there was a big bench there, and a whole bunch of youth were there. And you see a whole bunch of youth sitting in the darkness, and you think, oh boy, what's going on? So I got off my bike and I walked over to them and I said, what's going on? And they said, Mr. Leki, don't you know who we are? And I said, no, I can't even see you. And they said, we built this place. This is our place. We were here and we built it, and we come every once in a while and just hang out here. So it's like, oh, best, the best guardians of the garden. So
That's Pete, we couldn't have come up with a more perfect way to end this discussion. It's right at 6 o'clock. That's beautiful.
Thank you all for this opportunity to share. I appreciate it more than you know.
We appreciate you, Angela.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for attending this evening, everybody. And thank you so much to Robin and Ben from NeighborSpace, and Jessica and Pete and Angela. This was such a beautiful conversation and dialogue, and just really appreciate having you all here this evening. And we look forward to continuing these conversations and talking to you all soon. Have a great night.
Thanks so much.
Bye.